You're listening to In Bed with Science, a sex podcast. I'm Lee Noren, a sex therapist with a Master of Science in Sexology and over 12 years of coaching, counseling, and therapy experience. Today, we're talking about the science of sexual fantasies and the surprising gap between what people fear will happen if they share one and what actually does. Nearly 80% of those who opened up got a positive response. So the question is, why do so many of us stay silent? We'll break down the research and I'll guide you through a simple exercise to help you figure out whether sharing a fantasy is right for you. But first, do you have a sex or relationship question you want to ask, but you're not quite sure where to turn? Now's your chance. I'm looking for thoughtful, personal questions about things like intimacy, mismatched libidos, emotional disconnect, and struggles with sexual pleasure and desire. Specifically, those messy, non-Hollywood experiences that we all have but rarely talk about. And I'll be answering them in upcoming episodes of the podcast with both compassion and scientific insight. Submit your story or question anonymously, or with your name if you'd like, and it might be featured in a future episode. Now, let's dig in. We know that the vast majority of people have fantasies and that sexual fantasies can have benefits for sexual functioning. So greater desire, more orgasm consistency, arousal, and also overall pleasure. And we also know that few fantasies are truly rare. But despite all of this, I would venture to say that for most of us, we kind of harbor this fear or this worry surrounding our fantasies, and specifically what our partner or a potential future partner would think of them and how they would react. So today, we're looking at a scientific study all about this, sexual fantasies and reasons for sharing them with our partner and reasons for not sharing them. And what you're going to learn today is that there's a disconnect between that fear and that worry a lot of us have about disclosing private fantasies to our partner and the actual reactions that our partners tend to have. So what I often see when clients come to me and we discuss sexual communication and fantasies, a lot of the times, if we're talking, for instance, about low libido, what will happen is we'll start to uncover that there are things that turn them on. There are fantasies. And while they on an intellectual level understand that, the sharing of these fantasies or even just delving deeper into them on their own could be beneficial to their sex drive and their sex life with their partner, they're often deeply afraid of what might happen if and when they do. And they're afraid that their partner will judge them, maybe even be disgusted with them. They're also afraid that they might feel pressured to follow through or that their partner might think their fantasies are too much. And at its core, I'd say that what it's about is a fear of not being held or being loved after disclosure. So they stay silent, not because their fantasy is that outrageous, but because the idea of not being seen and not being understood feels really risky. And so in essence, it's like they protect themselves and their relationship from a threat that's really only perceived thus far. But the threat that they're worrying about is also actively getting in the way of a great sex life. The study we're looking at today is a 2024 research paper called A Content Analysis of Reasons for Disclosing Sexual Fantasies and Partner Responses, published in the Journal of Sex Research and written by Kimberley et al. The study wanted to explore why people choose to share or not share their sexual fantasies with a partner and how partners actually respond when fantasies are disclosed. Over 280 people in intimate relationships participated, and what they found was that most people had shared a fantasy with a partner. About 69% of participants had disclosed a sexual fantasy at some point in a relationship. Most who disclosed got a positive response. Over 80% said that their partner responded well, so with openness and curiosity or even sexual excitement, and they felt comfortable sharing again. But people who hadn't disclosed expected the opposite. So half of those who kept their fantasy private, they were afraid or they believed that their partner would respond negatively, either with judgment or discomfort or even rejection. So why did people share fantasies? Why do we do that? Well, the study found that there were 5 main reasons that people shared. There was sexual gratification, so wanting to try something new, spice things up, or increase pleasure. They shared to build connection, so to deepen that intimacy and increase trust or bond more closely. They shared because they felt safe, so trusting their partner or feeling comfortable enough to be open was important. They shared to improve communication, so some used that conversation to open the door to more honest sexual talk in general. Or they shared because of the fantasy's nature. So if it felt more acceptable or aligned with their identity, for instance, kink or other orientations, and they felt more confident sharing. And why did people not share fantasies? Well, the 5 most common reasons for not disclosing were a fear of a negative response, so a worry that their partner would judge or be hurt or feel pressured. Their partner's personality also played a role, so maybe thinking that their partner is too conservative or inexperienced, maybe even vanilla. They felt embarrassed or ashamed, so especially if the fantasy felt taboo or stigmatized. They also didn't share because of a lack of communication comfort, so the topic never came up or it felt too awkward to bring up the topic of sex. And finally, the fantasy content, so the belief that the fantasy was too extreme, too private, or just not meant to be acted on. There were a lot of details and nuances that I found fascinating. One of them is that, you might assume that people are more likely to share their fantasies when they're kind of tame and that they keep quiet about the ones that feel riskier or more taboo or, out there. But that's not actually what the research found. So the actual content of the fantasy, whether it was romantic, it was rough, maybe group sex, or something else entirely, it wasn't necessarily a strong predictor of whether someone chose to share it. Which to me suggests that for most people, it's not really about what the fantasy is about, right? Sometimes it is, but not necessarily always. It's more about how safe we feel, or how much shame or fear we've internalized. And I think that's such an important reminder because it's easy to get caught up in thinking, well, if only my fantasy were more normal, I'd feel more comfortable sharing it. But in reality, even so-called normal fantasies can feel vulnerable to say out loud, while some people can happily disclose things that might seem more edgy or complex. So maybe the real question isn't, is my fantasy too much, but rather, do I feel emotionally safe enough to be seen in this way? Another glaring result is that 80% of the responses were positive when it came to people who shared their fantasy with their partner. But almost 50% of people who hadn't shared said that they didn't for fear of a negative response. So let's sit with that for a bit, because those results are pretty staggering, aren't they? Most people think that they'll be judged, but when they actually share, they're met with curiosity, sometimes even excitement. And that says a lot about how fear can get in the way of connection. It's like we're bracing for a storm that never really comes. And in the process, we miss out on intimacy and we miss out on pleasure, right? And I think this speaks to something I said in the episode on keeping passion alive in long-term relationships, which is that communication is what we sex therapists see among couples who are satisfied in their relationships compared to those who are dissatisfied. And what I see in my practice is that when couples do start to communicate more about sex, they're usually instantly rewarded, either by more emotional closeness or a more positive reaction than they thought they would get, or just by sort of having more or better sex. But of course, it's not all butterflies and sunshine, right? When we're looking at the results from this study, they found that less than 10% of partner responses were negative. And these responses often included partners not showing an interest in the acts present in the fantasy, showing disinterest, or being hesitant. So one person said, they said that they didn't really have the same fantasies and didn't understand the appeal. And to me, this speaks to that very real threat that we have of not being understood. We as humans all want to be loved, we want to be seen and respected. And because a lot of us are maybe even subconsciously worried about that content of our fantasies, or perhaps we're just worried about having fantasies full stop, even if a reaction from a partner isn't necessarily full-blown negative, right? It's not like our partner is saying we're disgusting. It can still hurt, and it can still be a real barrier to disclosure. What it also shows is that sex isn't just about sex. And I say this all the time. You've probably even heard me say it in a previous episode, but it's worth saying again and again because sex in our culture is often reduced to a simple physical act that's almost devoid of any significant meaning. Or, at best case, it kind of means something about our relationship. And this happens a lot when we're in a relationship with sexual differences. So in my work with clients, I often see that when one partner has little or no desire for sex and the other person still wants it, there's this tension that builds. And it's not just sexually, it's emotionally. So sometimes the partner with lower desire may dismiss or even shame the other person's interest in sex. And this isn't out of cruelty. It's a way to protect themselves. And it often comes from two places. So first, when we feel pressured or we feel overwhelmed, we may get this instinct to kind of push back and defend ourselves. We might tell ourselves that, sex doesn't really matter, or that our partner's needs are shallow or less meaningful. And this can feel like a way to ease guilt and almost justify that disconnect that we're experiencing around how we view sex or value sex. And then secondly, our culture plays a role because, as I said, we live in a society that often treats sex as either frivolous or taboo or like a nice to have and not a real need. And while it's absolutely valid not to want sex or even need sex, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's equally important to recognize that a partner who does want sex isn't wrong for feeling that way either. And that sex doesn't just have to be them being really horny and just wanting to get a release. It could actually mean something, mean being held, mean being seen by you, be an extension of your love. Beyond those negative reactions, the results also showed that there was a worry that disclosure might make your partner feel obligated to enact a fantasy. So someone said, I'm afraid it might put too much pressure on them, and they might feel that they're obligated to act out my fantasy even if they don't want to. Likewise, it was also perceived that there was potential for disclosing to lead to unwanted sexual encounters. And disclosure in some cases was seen as holding the potential for leading to experiencing judgment or stigmatization or even legal threats. So someone said she would think I was a pervert and might make me go talk to someone, a counselor. So I've definitely had clients in the past who have been worried about sharing their fantasies, specifically because they thought that sharing them was the same thing as saying, hey, I want to try this. And that's a big leap for us to take, right? To share and then to immediately act on it. So it makes complete sense that we're afraid if that feels like the silent condition. The other fear that they often bring up is how it feels so full on. If they've never discussed wanting to play with power dynamics, going from sort of quote unquote vanilla sex to wanting to share about seriously trying out domination or some form of humiliation or, bondage can feel in and of itself a bit extreme. But here's the thing I want you to know. Disclosure doesn't have to be all or nothing. So just as some people in the study described easing into it, right? So sharing a milder fantasy first or waiting until their partner has shared something too, this is an approach that you can use as well. And it's a way to build gradual confidence in talking about these things with your partner. And then when they hopefully respond positively, that will make you feel more confident in bringing up more things in the future. And then maybe you could bring up those details of, for instance, trying out BDSM or whatever your fantasy might be. And finally, another reason why people chose not to disclose is because the fantasy signified something deeper. So for some people, fantasies aren't just arousing stories. They're part of who they are. So sharing isn't just about wanting to try something new in bed. It's about being known. And in these cases, sharing becomes a way to say, this is a part of me. Can you accept it? And so if this fantasy is a part of you, and it's a way of showing who you are sexually, of course, there's going to be some antsiness in terms of how your partner is going to respond. So the study showed a few different things. The most important takeaways were that sharing sexual fantasies can increase intimacy, pleasure, and communication. They also found that most people feel good about sharing afterward, and most partners respond positively. They found that the fear of judgment often holds people back more than the actual judgment itself. Still, what they also talked about is disclosure isn't always necessary, and it's okay to keep a fantasy private if that's what feels right for you. So, if sharing sexual fantasies can increase intimacy, pleasure, and communication, and it can strengthen relationships, it brings us to this point of vulnerability. Right? Because vulnerability is what we're talking about here in its essence. And vulnerability in general, I found, is important to desire and relationship satisfaction. So feeling like you have almost this kind of secret shared world that no one else knows about, right? That is your relationship, can increase feelings of passion and excitement. And vulnerability can feel especially gratifying when you're met with this validating and positive response. And overall, vulnerability builds intimacy in our relationship. So if you think of sharing fantasies from that perspective, it's not that we're sharing fantasies only because it has to do with our sex life or improving our sex life somehow or, making it more exciting. It's also about that general level of vulnerability and getting close to your partner, and sharing fantasies can be a way to do that beyond just getting closer sexually. We also know that choosing not to share doesn't only mean that you risk missing out on the positives. For some, it actually takes a toll. So some participants described how not sharing actually started to wear on them. So they kind of felt like they were split or like they were hiding something really essential. So if sharing fantasies could potentially help you create a more satisfying sex life and increase desire, and also help you feel more whole and more seen, should you share your fantasy with your partner? And my answer is not necessarily. In fact, it can go really wrong if you're sharing from the place of, I should share. So sharing a fantasy should, in my mind, really come from a place of wanting to experience something positive. Now, this doesn't mean that it might not still feel nerve-wracking or make you a bit anxious, but ultimately, you're sharing it to receive a reward, not a punishment. And that reward might be relational and emotional intimacy, but it could also be that sexual intimacy or pleasure. And the other thing to keep in mind is that sharing a fantasy is not a sign of how evolved you are or how exciting you are as a partner. It's completely okay to never share a fantasy, or share some and not all of them. Because sharing fantasies is deeply intimate for most people. And whether you're not ready today, or you might be in 2 years' time, or whether you just want to keep your fantasy to yourself, it's all valid. So before we even start to talk about how to share a fantasy, I want to give you an exercise to work out your own reasons for either sharing or not sharing with your partner, so that whether you disclose or you keep it to yourself, you'll be doing it for the right reasons. Step number 1, reflect on your fantasy. So think of a sexual fantasy that you've had more than once. And when you do this, what feelings come up when you think about sharing it with your current partner or sharing it with a future one? So it could be feelings like shame or guilt, sadness, worry, fear. There might even be positive ones like arousal or excitement or sexual longing or emotional longing or desire. And what would make you want to share this? So maybe wanting to try something new with one another, or you want to infuse your sex life with new energy. Maybe you're just curious about their reaction and whether your partner shares similar fantasies. Or maybe you're hoping it will light your desire on fire again. Step number 2, identify your hidden blocks. So what's stopping you from sharing it, if anything? So some examples could be, I'm afraid they'll be hurt by my fantasy, or I'm worried that they'll be disgusted or maybe even want to leave me. Or I'm fairly certain they don't like the kinds of things I like, so it's not going to lead to anything, therefore it's just best not to share it. And then ask yourself, where did you learn that certain fantasies, or having fantasies at all, if you're in a monogamous relationship, are unacceptable? So for example, maybe it comes from religion and certain sexual practices being deemed not okay, or that even just lusting after someone else is a sign of infidelity. Or maybe you've heard people joke about your specific fantasy before as if it's sick or it's wrong. Or maybe it's because you've only ever seen that fantasy depicted in porn, and porn isn't exactly something we as a society talk about as a positive thing. And if you imagine your partner being supportive, does that change how you feel about it? And if so, in what ways? So maybe you feel lighter, like what you fantasize about is more okay, and that makes the idea of sharing easier. Or maybe you feel a little warm inside, like, okay, this might lead to closeness. Or maybe you just feel in the mood for sex, and that the idea of your partner being supportive leads to arousal and desire. Step number 3, clarify what you want and not what you believe you should do. So after going through all of this, do you want to share your fantasy or your fantasies? Yes? No? Maybe? And what would sharing this do for you emotionally or relationally? So, for example, you might feel closer emotionally. You might feel like it gives you both something new to try out. It might increase your desire and arousal in the moment, or help you feel seen and validated. And finally, is there another way to honor this fantasy? Could be mentally, emotionally, or physically, that doesn't involve disclosure. So for instance, could you seek out erotic stories around the theme to really immerse yourself in your fantasy and make masturbation even better? Or could you seek out forums like threads on Reddit where other people talk about fantasies that you have that could potentially reduce any deep-seated shame you're sitting with for feeling alone with your fantasy? At the end of the day, sharing fantasies can be really rewarding. But I want to make sure that if you do that, you're sharing for the right reasons. So I hope this exercise has been helpful. Now, if you want this exercise, you want to do it on your screen or print it out, join my email list using the link in the show notes, and I'll send it to you right away. As with all studies, this one had its own set of limitations. The study mostly included young, white participants from Western countries. Only 8% were not cisgender, and most were recruited online, likely more open to discussing sex. And since it was correlational, we can't say fantasy disclosure causes greater intimacy, only that they're linked. That's it for In Bed with Science. Please remember that everything shared in this episode is for informational purposes only and isn't a substitute for medical advice or therapy. For personal support, please reach out to a qualified professional. If you're looking to get your desire back without pressure and stress and have more and better sex, head to leanoren.com or click on the link in the show notes to learn more about my one-to-one online program, Be Desire. Thanks for listening.